So this idea of the inclusivist versus residualist, a couple of opinions on what you think this distinction means and what would be the more Islamic perspective on this issue. Anybody want to say something? Yes?
Just based on what we've covered in the first session, I would think that Islamically we are more inclined towards an inclusivist, I suppose, categorization, where people are, according to the Islamic ideal, they can move between one country and the next regardless of motivation.
Yep.
And there is specific need to look out for those that are vulnerable and persecuted and not in a particularly good place. But there, in the residualist, there is that distinction between a migrant and a refugee. So I think that's all I.
Which is it important?
I think it is important because I think it will make a difference for the outcome. So there is that restriction in terms of movement transnationally. I think that's all I have to say. I haven't thought it further.
What did you want to say?
Yeah. So my point is, I totally agree with my colleague from Netherlands, and I'm thinking about one thing that it happens in my country. I'm from Italy and Switzerland too, so in my two countries. My problem is one, we work a lot in Italy for interreligious dialogue. Every day, no one knows this. The Vatican City welcomes something like 200 refugees with private airplane from Syria and Lebanon. Syrian refugees. So my first question is, the Vatican City work with Islamic Relief and Islamic organization to welcome Muslims in my country and in Europe, and I totally agree with this decision. But the point is, we Muslim and Christian in my country, we work together to prevent the life, to help these people, and we can welcome them. But why I cannot see the same thing created by an Arabic state who has more money than Italy? And then my second question is, in Italy we are facing another problem. There is to say, if a person go to a migration center, we have a lot of people coming from Muslim countries, in Africa, not Syria and Middle East, but from Africa, who are saying, I'm an asylum seeker because I'm homosexual. And that's the point. But even if it's not true. So how can we make a difference between who is a real asylum seeker and who is not? I know it's not a real question, but it's just brainstorming. But
Well, yes.
I'd like to comment upon the situation of migration in the Indian context. I think what mostly influences how the government deals with migrants is the foreign policy and also the vote bank politics. Like in case of Afghans, I think that why India invested so much in having good relations. India wanted to have better relations with the Afghan government. I think that's one of the chief reasons why it hosted so many Afghan migrants. And also about the vote bank politics, like we see that India is the government is always keen to host Hindu migrants from from Pakistan and from Bangladesh, but on the same side is very hostile to the Rohingya Muslims. I think that has a lot to do with the vote bank politics in the Indian context. Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question for her. Why can a European person move everywhere, and why can an African person move everywhere?
I totally agree with you. No, that's not my point. I totally agree with you. I'm from a world without borders. So, okay. From the political point of view, we cannot do it.
If I could comment on the earlier question. So one thing about, for example, in Italy, it's true, like these sort of dialogue is being made from the Vatican's part, but a lot of Muslims in Italy don't even have a mosque to pray in. So the majority of mosques actually, they pray their Friday prayers in a warehouse, right? And actually there has been several international attempts at religious dialogue. So for example, A Common Word Between Us, you had the initiative by the King of Jordan. The problem with these initiatives is, like everything in the Middle East, they're very politicized, right? So the Vatican has a relatively privileged position in that it can sort of, it speaks about religion from a relatively depoliticized position, right? Whereas in the Middle East, we just don't really have, that doesn't exist. Everything is politicized, for better or for worse. I think another thing that keeps on popping up that we haven't really fully brought to the table is the issue of power, right, on a global scale. So for example, one reason why a lot of Gulf states haven't taken Syrian refugees is because they don't want to go there, because they already know there's no human rights there for people who are already there. Plus, the issue is, if the world is willing to let Syria itself burn, why would they do anything for Syrian refugees in Gulf states? Whereas when Syrian refugees go to Europe, they can then use the power difference that is there to shame Europeans into letting them have a better life. So I think something we really need to talk here is about the power differentials when we talk about migration and why somebody chooses to go somewhere instead of other places. Even though very clearly there are certain parts where I'm currently living in Turkey, and I know a lot of Syrians, and they say, I want to go to Europe, and I say, you should actually stay here, because it's actually in some ways easier for you, you can integrate easier, whatnot. But very clearly, this sort of image has been built by Europe and America for decades now, that we are the place to come, right? So even, Fareed Zakri in his book, The Post-American World, he said, it's very ironic of America to be mad that people, basically what happened in the 80s, right, with the Washington Consensus is they said, listen, everywhere we are now going to play the same game, right? And then when certain countries are now getting good at it, they get mad, right? So there's these, I think these power differentials here have to be core and center of any argument or debate we have or discussion we have on migration. It's crucial, right? Who's a refugee, who is an expat? Why are certain people expats, certain people are migrants? Why are some people migrants and some people are refugees?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point that you're making. It's about responsibility, the responsibility to say, okay, only Muslims have the responsibility for Muslim refugees, or it doesn't make any sense. Of course, who is waging war in those countries? If it's America and Russia, why are not they taking in the refugees, for example? Why are we not asking that question?
Yes?
Political rights or benefits versus refugee, perhaps maybe humanitarian benefits. In the case of Palestinians, it has always been the case of the Arab states and the Arab League to maintain the status of Palestinians as refugees. If we take this as a case, which really in the long run played a vital role, basically contributed positively, helped maintain pressure, kept the right to return alive. We see what is happening in Gaza right now, perhaps. And that explains, at least in part, why the UNRWA basically has been under pressure recently. There is a tendency here to forget about this dimension, the political dimension here. Political benefit is as valid as basically the humanitarian protection, benefits. Children, majority are children, of course, need education. A great deal of services are needed. It struck me that the ayah you mentioned, حتى يبلغ مأمنة, I would like to go back and study this more in depth. I wonder if that political dimension also is included in that in the context of that ayah here. It's not only protection, but also perhaps maybe what someone basically is entitled. Palestinians are entitled to go back to their own homeland. Syrian perhaps maybe are the same. And perhaps maybe this also explains the position the Gulf states have been taking. Many of these states, basically, I came from Kuwait. Kuwait held perhaps maybe 2 conventions in which they brought all the rich states and raised a great deal of fund. And the Gulf states basically justified their position by saying, look, we use our financial position here to alleviate perhaps the financial burden on Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon. We're not taking physically refugees in our countries, but hey, we're making it possible for these people to stay next land, because we don't see this as a permanent. We see this basically as a transition, and we would like basically to maintain the pressure so these people at some point will ultimately be able to go back. And so the position can be well justified on this basis, because this is not permanent. And these people perhaps maybe is not their long-term objective is really to migrate. Syria is a rich, diverse, has all the resources. It's just the political conditions are not right now. And so these states basically await change in that political condition to change, so these people basically can really are able to end their refugee status.
Very good comment. Thank you.
Something I would like to add as a reply to you. Why I feel, of course, there is so much to be said about the ethics of European countries and of my own country, but why I feel we talk about these countries and Muslim countries right now is because we are doing a winter school on applied Islamic ethics, and I think these ethics are more appropriate in the context of Islamic countries as opposed to European countries, which are at the core not Islamic. So that's why I feel this is the appropriate place to talk about the ethics of these countries. Yeah, and that's why I brought it up, not to be the Dutch guy, the European guy telling the Islamic countries what to do, most definitely not, but because I feel this is the appropriate place to kickstart such a conversation.
Just to clarify one point you made here, there is some literature talking about the Gulf states, in particular a guy called Sari Hanafi, who wrote a paper arguing that the Gulf states have adopted more of a policy of pity rather than a humanitarian policy, because they have been much more concerned to offer financial aid instead of bringing them into their own countries, the Syrians in particular, and that this is problematic. So you can make up your own minds about how you feel with regard to this distinction between giving money, giving aid, or aiding individuals to come and integrate, or to provide a livelihood for those in need. But you're quite right about the politics and the politics of return. I mean, many Palestinians, for example, have been prevented from going to other countries and pursuing education and so on because of the principle of the right of return. I mean, leaders in these camps often prevented young people from pursuing their dreams, so to speak, and this is highly problematic. Yeah, the individuals get caught up in the principles that are highly political. Let me thank you very much. If I could just say one thing about this, is that the UNHCR takes the residualist perspective because that's its mandate. Its mandate is to provide protection to refugees who are genuine refugees, and to determine who are refugees and who are not, right? So there are, you can look this up if you like, in terms of how the individual status, refugee status determination procedures are established, and how to distinguish between a refugee, and that doesn't always help. We know that in Europe at that time there was so much going on, that Afghans were pretending to be Syrians in order to get refugee status to move on and get accepted and so, yeah, but these are exceptions. They don't make the rule, right? It's not everybody. So from, the actions of a few, you don't make the judgment about the whole. So you need to look carefully into what is happening and not to generalize too much about these things. So so that's that. Let me move on, and I've just got a couple of things I want to show you. The issue of human trafficking is an important one. This is the definition from what's called the Palermo Protocol on human trafficking. It has 3 dimensions. One is recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, or the receipt of persons. The second part is by means of threat, force, coercion, abduction, importantly, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability. The third part is for the purpose of exploitation, whether it be labour exploitation or prostitution and sexual exploitation and so on and so forth. This is the definition of human trafficking. And a lot of my research on migrant labour in the Gulf states and in other Arab countries like Lebanon, Jordan in particular, suggest that in fact if we look closely at the recruitment of migrant labour to these countries, we will see that in some sense human trafficking is the norm. Okay, and I'm going to show that to you in a moment. The United States State Department has established the Trafficking in Persons report. It's an annual report on human trafficking around the world, and it classifies all the different countries into a 3-tier ranking based upon whether they're doing anything to prevent trafficking or to prosecute traffickers. The actual prosecution of traffickers is very little when you look at how much human trafficking actually occurs. It's more likely that the resources and actions of governments and NGOs and so on will help to protect victims or assist victims of trafficking rather than prosecute traffickers, which is it's proven very difficult to prosecute traffickers, to identify and prosecute them. I know that there was a documentary on Nepal many years ago called The Selling of Innocence. It was a documentary that brought me to tears and stimulated my interest in this area. If you can get hold of it, it's well worth watching how these young girls get trafficked. They're coming from rural areas, very poor, very ignorant, illiterate, and so on and so forth. In Egypt, there's the Urfi marriages that have now been classified as a form of human trafficking, where men from the Gulf states would go to these small villages in Egypt and make these contracts with young women for a weekend, or even if they take them back home with them, if they get pregnant, they send them back to the village because they don't want them any longer. These sorts of things are pretty shameful, but they exist and are now classified as a form of human trafficking, and so on and so forth. I want to just make a very brief mention of the kafala system. I'm not going to agonize about this, but basically it is the idea of sponsorship, or originally the idea of a trusteeship, which is what we would call under British law, the idea of the fiduciary, somebody who will take responsibility and the obligation to assist somebody else who may be vulnerable, and so on and so forth, to help. So it's an idea of protection and responsibility in an unequal power relationship, right? The sponsorship system was really, this is only very, very recent research showed that, in fact, it was the British colonial authorities who brought in this sponsorship system in Bahrain in the 1920s, and then later was called the kafala because there was this tradition of the kafala within Islam. Today, the application of the kafala system to foreign labour is a contemporary 20th century phenomenon, right? It was not there prior to the 20th century. So it was a system that was convenient, where the governments of the Gulf states, gaining great wealth and wanting to develop that wealth, the oil fields and so on, and develop the countries, needed foreign labour. This was one way to give power to the citizens as a form of, also a form of economic redistribution mechanism, so that any company that came here that wanted to do business, 51% ownership had to be with a Qatari or with a GCC national, right? So gaining what was called, generally economists will call it a rentier states. You would understand that. Rentier states was the idea of renting out until they began to nationalise the oil fields and the companies producing the wealth and getting that wealth for themselves. So this was this idea of controlling, but having the citizens themselves making the decisions as to who's coming into the country to work for them. The sponsor has to be the employer of the foreign labour that's coming in, right? So, and the sponsor, or the kafil, is the person who has tremendous control over the makful, the foreigner or the foreign worker, whether they're professionals or low-skilled workers, right? And they will control their entry, control their exit in some cases. Certainly, it's been the case in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, although that's about to be abolished entirely in Qatar. And also preventing them from changing employers, right? Tremendous control over individuals under their sponsorship, which has led to many external commentators and critics basically likening the kafala system to a form of modern-day slavery. And that has been a catch cry in the critique of the Gulf states with regard to migrant labour. So what it has meant is that it has minimised the competition between citizens, so preventing companies from, you know, what we call poaching labour from other employers for yourself, to offer more wages and better conditions and so on. That doesn't occur. So there's no local labour market operating in the Gulf states. It's an international labour market. People are recruited from their countries of origin, not locally, right? Except in Bahrain and some other countries have made some changes to allow some local labour market, which is going to also happen here in Qatar this year. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a case study of my research on the labour recruitment process to the Gulf, and this also operates in other countries as well. It's not exclusive to the Gulf, but the conditions of the kafala make it particularly important to understand here. So what happens, what I would argue is that the demand for labour begins when a company, when there is a project, something to be done, like a construction project, a building, a hotel, a road, the metro, anything, right, that needs to be done, requires companies to bid to get the contract to do that project, right? So it has to be a competitive process. And so companies bid for a project. There are two elements to this bidding, this tendering process. The first is a technical evaluation where whoever it might be assesses whether the company is technically capable of doing the job. All of those companies that are found to be technically capable then go on to the next phase, which is what they call the commercial evaluation, as to the price. Now, if I'm making a judgment as to who I'm going to give the contract to, I'll say, well, the company that comes up with the lowest price will get the contract, will get the job, right? Because that'll save me money. And then they negotiate the best price, right? Now, they'll also squeeze the company that gets the project to actually make their bid even lower, right? Squeeze the price to that's part of the negotiation business process, right? Now, part of the process has been for decades now in the Gulf states and elsewhere is that in order to reduce and keep their budget at a minimum, companies have decided that they don't need to pay for the recruitment costs of bringing migrant labour in to work for them, right? That will increase their price competitiveness when they're bidding, right? And it will improve their chances of getting the project. But that's not been a very transparent process. In the tendering process, companies are not required to state what they're going to pay for labour. There's no transparency of what their budget is to bring in labour and to pay for labour. And in fact, what has developed is this idea called the worker pays model. So what's happened over these decades is that workers themselves pay money to get the jobs here in the GCC. I don't know if you're aware of that. Okay. Now, the worker pays model creates what we might call a market distortion. That is, the selection of the workers who are going to be brought over here is on the basis of their willingness and ability to pay, right? Rather than their skills, their qualifications, and their suitability and experience in order to get the best people to do the job. And this has allowed all kinds of fraudulent activity. It allows deception in wage levels and conditions, what we call substitute contracts. You're given a contract in Bangladesh. When you arrive, you're given another contract, which is less money, right? And you may be given a food allowance, but when you arrive, that food allowance is less than what you were promised. That's deception. And if you have that deception, and if you are then bringing people over and you're exploiting them, what is that? I just gave you the definition, human trafficking, right? So with the kafala system, these conditions creates what we call debt bondage, because the money that the workers pay, they often have to get loans, and they might go to loan sharks. They can pay up to 60 or 80% interest. This is haram, right? For the money that they have to borrow in order to get the job, right? Nothing in the GCC is stopping this. Even though in countries of destination, in 4 of the GCC countries, the labour law forbids workers to be charged for recruitment costs. And yet it still happens. So this creates debt bondage. That is, you know, the old story when when I interview workers, for example, I say, you know, are you getting what you were promised before you came? No, I'm not. Well, did you tell the company when you arrived? Yes, I did. So what did the company say? They said, well, if you don't like it, you can go home. Now, the company knows that he's paid and he's in debt. The company knows that he cannot go home. The company also needs to give him permission to go home, but he's stuck, right? So he has to accept a lower wage, a lower food allowance than what he was promised. That's trafficking. That's also forced labour, forcing him to do a job for the conditions that he doesn't accept, right? And this is what often is referred to as modern day slavery. Because it's not ownership of the person, it's control over the person. The kafala has tremendous control over the workforce. And what it does, it feeds corruption, right? What happens is this. So I'm an agency, a recruitment agent in Nepal, for example, and I am given the task to recruit workers to come to Qatar. Now, in order to get the contract to supply the workers, the Nepali workers, to come to Qatar, I have to compete with other agents, right? So I say to the employing company, if you give me the contract, you have to pay, you can reduce the wages. You won't have to pay any of the costs of bringing the workers over. We'll pay for that. Not only that, we'll pay you something. We'll give you some money on the side in order to give us the contract, right? And that's what's called kickback bribery. So this is the corruption that has been going on for decades. And I'm going to give you an example.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Excuse me, I'm always see the country look for the benefits of the worker, but nobody care about the owner of the company. So because you pay too much and you have promise from the regency about to bring the people worker, then you find the people come, no experience, no anything, no any thing they say is when is in country like Nepal or India, whatever, which is the country. But you come, you have any problem or drop in your work because as you owner of company, you pay too much taxes, you pay your effort, your time, your study, everything to make your factory or your project success. But you have problem, you just pay for the company to bring the people and the people come, no benefits. And when they coming in Qatar, they say, no, we need to transfer ship to another sponsor and they not give you what they say before they coming. So the problem all come about the owner of the company, of the business sector, not about the worker. Always think about the human rights for worker. Nobody look about the economy or the business of the country. I'll say about issue. I already suffer from this one. After me bring and teach and training and try to make my best to make them good, they say, no, we want to go to other place and you pay 15,000 or 16,000 for everyone to bring from his country after you teach, after you tired. Then say, no, I want to go another place.
Well, up until now, for them to transfer sponsorship has been your decision because you are the sponsor. If you do not give them an NOC, then they cannot go anyway. And that's going to change very soon. The promise is that NOCs will be abolished in Qatar, which means that an individual worker can change employers without permission of the original
But the law not give. The law not give.
That's not there yet, but it's going to come in. It's been promised from January 2020. So, if a person leaves your company to go to somewhere else, you will file an absconding registration. You'll register that the person has absconded, has run away, right, from you because you're their sponsor. Now, if you do that, that person can be arrested, detained, and deported, right? So that becomes a criminal act under this system. And if you have this idea of running away, which particularly for domestic workers, it still exists, this is a term of slavery. You know, one of the principal issues about labour is that people should be free to withdraw their labour. That's what the French Revolution was all about, for God's sake. So people should be free to withdraw their labour. They should not be forced. There are conventions and laws against forced labour. Now, yes, as an employer, you have a responsibility to choose the best people to come and work for you, right? Unfortunately, what I'm just showing you now is the worker pays model. Okay, you're paying. So that's different from a lot of companies who don't pay. The worker pays, but even if the company does pay all the recruitment costs, that does not stop the agency in the origin country from also charging the worker and taking the money from the employer, from both sides.
Yeah.
We know that occurs, right? So, so this is the thing. These kickback payments are also what drives the motivations to bring more, in fact, excessive numbers of migrant workers into the country. Let me just give you an example. Bangladesh, here's the actual costs of recruiting Bangladeshi workers. Bangladeshi workers, these are low-skilled, low-income workers. They pay pretty much more than any other nationality. They're paying on average about $3,300 in order to get a job, okay, which is a lot of money for them. These are the actual costs on average, okay? So let's say that overall total of the cost is $1,222 US dollars. I'm using dollars here, okay? Now, the charge to a Bangladeshi worker is $3,300 on average, sometimes more, sometimes less. Now, if the actual cost is $1,222, the difference, let's say the employer pays the airfare. So the difference, the surplus that the Bangladeshi worker pays is $2,478, even if they're paying, these costs, which they shouldn't be in the first place. They shouldn't be paying anything, right? The ILO Convention 181 says no costs are to be forced upon the employee. So how is this? Where does this money? Where does this almost $2,500 go? Where does it go? Well, it goes in kickback payments. On average, I'm arguing, it's an estimation, on average about $1,000 goes to the employer, the person who's actually choosing which agency to supply the labour. I did the research on this, and I was offered a bribe myself because the person just refused to accept my explanation that I was just there to do research. They thought I was there from the Qatar Foundation to choose a recruitment agency. So, I got fed up one day and I said, okay, what's in it for me? And he said, we can't talk about this on the telephone. So let's meet for coffee. So we met for coffee. And I said, well, what if I give you a contract for 30 workers? He said, well, we'll give you $400. I said, well, what if I give you a contract for 100 workers? No, we'll give you $600. This is per worker. For 100 workers, he was offering me $60,000 in my pocket, cash, no paperwork. This is the kind of money that is being bandied around. This is the kickback bribery that's occurring, right? So if you take an average of $1,000 per worker, if you multiply that by 1,000 workers, that's $1 million. You multiply it by 1 million workers, it's $1 billion. You multiply that by 10 million, that's $10 billion, right? This is money that's flowing out of the countries of origin as kickback payments to the employing company or the personnel of the employing company in the countries of destination, right? So if it's Bangladesh, you have an average about 500,000 Bangladeshi workers are leaving that country every year. that's $500 million leaving the country as well, just for the kickback, fraudulent, corrupt payments. Okay, it's not factored into their national accounts. They calculate the remittances. Countries of origin are very concerned to maximise the number of people leaving their country getting jobs, particularly in the Gulf states. Why? Because when the money that they earn, they send it all back to their families back home. That's what supports their families. That's why they come here. And that's called remittances. The financial remittances to those countries are crucial. It's the largest source of foreign currency earnings for those countries, and high proportions of their GDPs, which makes it very important. So they're actually losing money through this kickback bribery. And there's approximately 20 million low-skilled migrant workers in the GCC. So we're talking about just the fraudulent payments of around up to $20 billion, right? It is a big industry, and it's very seductive for those who are greedy. Here's a case example for you. This is a ledger from a recruitment agency, right? A ledger that shows labour coming in and paying, but you'll see, you'll see here, cash paid. This is in the UAE. Cash paid in dirhams, 15,000. Cash paid, 10,000. See here, paid to Sri Lanka in a telegraphic transfer, 50,000. Another telegraphic transfer, 50,000. And another one here, 50,000. This is the kickback money that is being given to the personnel of the employing company in the UAE, right? This is the kickback bribe to provide that agency with the contract to supply the labour, right? And as proof, further proof, here is a copy of a telegraphic transfer of the 50,000, right? Going to Sri Lanka. We have the account number, the person's name, it's all evidence. I had the details of all the payments for 2 years to this person who was the human resource manager of the company, employing company, that showed that for the years 2015 and 2016, that individual was receiving over $500,000 just in the kickback bribery for bringing in the labour to that company. That's only one person, one company getting $500,000 in addition to his salary, right? This is the corruption that's occurring. This is the worker pays model. And now, of course, many people are aware of this, and now there are moves and campaigns to correct this process. Oh, this is just another form of fraud. This is a contract of a cleaner who you can see in the contract is receiving 1,100 reals per month and 300 reals for a food allowance, right? But when we see that person's pay slip, what do we see? We see that it's only 200 food allowance that's being paid, not the 300 that's in the contract. Plus, this company was unashamedly saying that 100 reals per month is being taken out for recruitment, for the recruitment charges. This is totally against the law, against Qatari law. Right? But they're so confident that they put it on the pay slip. Right? Because it's not being policed or picked up. Okay? So these sorts of things go on, but they might seem trite in terms of the amount of money. But if you actually just do a very simple calculation, that you multiply that by the number of employees, how much money can actually be saved by these companies at the expense of the workforce, it's quite clear, right? So, you know, we have Islamic principles with regard to wages, about paying. You know, one of the most famous, of course, is that you should give to the worker his wages before his sweat dries, right? So that's the basic principle of pay the worker, pay the employee on time, right? And all the Gulf states basically now have established what's called a wage protection system, where companies have to pay workers into a bank account so that there is an official record of the workers having been paid. Why is this? Because many workers don't get paid. They come, they work for years, sometimes they just don't get paid. A month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. And particularly in the construction sector, and the construction sector is where most employees and low-skilled employees are in the Gulf states. So it's not only to pay on time, but also we find these principles of paying properly. In other words, pay the person what they are owed and pay them on time. Okay? These principles are not being abided by, and particularly in the construction sector. Anyway, it's another long story about what's happening in construction, where there is, in fact, deliberate non-payment of subcontractors and so on, and then workers end up not being paid. Companies go bankrupt. They are often quite deliberately forced to go bankrupt, and so on. This happens in the construction industry.
Dr. Ray, I'm not sure if you've had any foreknowledge of how they treat them in terms of injuries. So, for example, the construction industry is probably quite high risk. It's an OH&S issue, or many issues in that regard. So, like wage aside, what happens, for example, with employees that become injured or cannot work? What is their policy?
Most places in Qatar, for example, have extensive health and safety regulations. In fact, they use the British health and safety regulations, which are quite extensive. You always get some companies that, you know, and some situations where, you know, proper safety measures and so on are not there, and people get hurt and injured. There's been tremendous publicity recently, well, for some time now actually, about the deaths of workers on construction sites in various places. I've done some analysis of that also. But here we get into all sorts of vexed issues with regard to the deaths. But health and safety, particularly in construction, is the same worldwide. ILO did a study to compare the deaths and injuries of workers from Nepal and 1 or 2 other countries with the same injury and death rates back in their home countries. It's pretty much the same. So while there's a lot of hullabaloo about this, it's not always based upon proper investigative data and information. And that's partly, at least, well, maybe more than partly, the fault and responsibility of the governments in the GCC states to actually do proper inquiries. Some studies have been done about health. You see Indian workers have come here, their health deteriorates because they're eating, the nutrition of the food that they're eating is absolutely detrimental to them, and you have high risks of hypertension, kidney problems, and heart issues and diabetes and so on. That's because they're not eating properly. Study was done here recently by Weill Cornell on nutrition for the Supreme Committee for the World Cup. we haven't seen, that was not publicised, or was not published rather. So I haven't seen the results of that, but it was a 3-year study on nutrition of the workforce. So there are many, many issues here. We also have this phenomenon called the unexplained sudden cardiac arrest syndrome. It's unexplained by the medical profession. And it's this sudden death, and particularly of Asian men. It was first identified in the 1980s in the United States with Vietnamese people, young Asian men dying very early. And it's not properly explained. They die, like some call it a sleep death. They die in their sleep. And there's been no study. I've proposed a study. It got stopped. They didn't want to do it. So there are many issues. So you're quite right to raise this. But there are many unanswered questions.
It seems their issues is not dissimilar to the indigenous population within Australia, for example, Canada. High burden of disease, high mortality, low life expectancy.
Yep. Yes.
I just wanted to ask, recently in Afghanistan, protests and strikes done by labor workers, how effective are this actually changing in terms of, especially in comparison to foreign governments getting involved with the embassy of the Philippines when they passed a law that foster companies can no longer withdraw the passports of domestic workers. So do strikes of the labor workers actually have any impact, or is it the involvement of the embassy of the country region that actually causes changes, or those completely ineffective?
No, I don't think so. First of all, there's been a law against withholding of the passport here for a long, long time. They recently increased the penalties for withholding against the wishes of the worker. This is where the dilemma arises. When you talk to the companies that are holding the passport, they say, we're doing it because they want us to hold the passport for security. So we say you should have, in the accommodation site, you should have a lockable storage. So you have no excuse to hold the passport. They can have it, they can lock it up and have it secure. This has been happening too. But when you had an exit visa, holding the passport, so what? They still need an exit visa. You can still have your passport and the employer or the sponsor can stop you from leaving the country. So these are vexed issues. But, going on strike, I mean, first of all, that recent strike, it was because workers were not paid. And that was picked up by the Wage Protection System unit in the Ministry of Labour, in the Labour Inspectorate Department. It was picked up and they couldn't do anything about it. And then finally the workers went on strike. And the managers and somebody, they were immediately arrested, put into prison and said, pay the workers. You won't get out until they get paid. And suddenly the money was found and they got paid. Well, not all of them, in fact. We're still trying to find out the details, but many left before they were paid. Many stayed, got paid. Many stayed, still haven't got paid. Some got other jobs, others didn't. It's, this was about 1,200 workers we're talking about here. So, But the extent to which the strikes influence policy changes, I don't think so. And Islam is very hostile, basically, to what we call wildcat strikes. So that's another issue. Yeah. Let me just move on. Let me just see what else I've got for you. Yeah. So there have been a lot of movements now with regard to the recruitment process that I've just explained to you. It's well known, but not many are actually doing anything about this. It's all because it's all illegal activity and it's happening, secretly. The recent Global Compact for Migration that was concluded in June 2018 has within it the Objective 6 to facilitate fair and ethical recruitment and safeguard conditions that ensure decent work. There have been campaigns by the International Labour Organization and the International Organization for Migration around the idea of fair or ethical recruitment, where workers are not charged anything for their recruitment. Okay. Now, this is happening at an international level. The extent to which it's working, we still don't know. We still know that there are workers coming into this country and others who have paid, who continue to pay. Some of them are paying less than what they paid before because they're becoming more aware and so on, but it's a complex situation and we still haven't got a real clear idea of how it's panning out. Same with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, to protect labour rights, promote safe and secure working environments of all workers, right, and particularly women migrants and those in precarious employment, to promote the rule of law, justice, and to reduce corruption and bribery in all its forms. These are laudable policies. The problem is having it work, is the compliance with these principles in reality. Okay. I still have some time, I think. Okay, I'll do this very, very quickly for you, and then we can open it up. I'll go. Forgive me for going through it quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but I think you'll find this interesting. So I did a study of domestic workers, migrant domestic workers in Lebanon when I first went to the American University of Beirut, which set me off on a lot of this migrant labour research. So I did a study, I forget how many people, 610 migrant domestic workers interviewed. At that time, talking about March 2006, well, around 2006, it was mainly Sri Lankan workers, domestic workers, all female, but also Philippines and those from Philippines and Ethiopia. That all changed, of course. That mix changed in 2006 when Israel invaded Lebanon, and there were lots of evacuations of the domestic workers. They went home, and then a ban was placed on Lebanon because of the security situation, and so things changed. Anyway, the point is that these are the countries of origin of the sample. What do we find? Hours of work. 65% worked 11 or more hours per day. 42% worked 13 or more hours per day. And 31%, almost a third, worked 15 or more hours per day. This is in the household. Okay? This is against all international standards. And this continues, by the way, and it's common throughout the Gulf states and other countries as well.
Just a question. How is work defined? I mean, when I'm sitting in the living room with the family and just ready to get orders,
You're on call.
I'm on call.
Yeah, you're on call, therefore you're working. Yeah, and I mean, some of the women we interviewed said we're on call 24 hours a day. They can be woken up in the middle of the night if something's, a child needs something or something like that. They're on call. So that.
In that context, I mean, when I have such a choice to work in my house, am I saying, okay, you are now free, you can go?
Yes.
So it's like I have to say it and then it's free, and then I tell her, please be back at 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, well, that's. Yes.
Outside or stay in her room or sit with me in the living room, it's up to her.
Yeah, quite often employers of domestic workers might give them a day off or some hours off, but they're not allowed to leave the house, right? Or they can only leave the house if they're accompanied by a family member. So there are tremendous restrictions of the freedom of movement where, by all standards, any employee needs time off, needs rest. And that time off or rest should be at the discretion of the worker. In other words, you should have the right to do what you want during that time, to be able to go out or not, right? But you shouldn't be told that you cannot go out. And many domestic workers are not allowed to leave the household. Many are not even given time off, right?
We weren't exploring mental health issue amongst the
There are, well, we have, there are many mental health issues, some of which are not very pleasant to talk about, but yeah, there are issues.
Isn't it that domestic workers do face, I mean, the females do face sexual harassment too?
Yes, I'll come to that.
So, okay.
We have some figures on that. So, did you make any payments to the agency after your arrival? Yeah, employers often take money from their salary in the first 2 or 3 months to pay for their recruitment, which is against the law, which they shouldn't, but they do, and get away with it. Have now issues about abuse. So verbal abuse. Have your employers yelled at you? You know, this was a vexed issue because people argued that, you know, Lebanese yell at everybody, right? So, you know, you've got to, it's an acculturation thing, you know, you should get used to being yelled at. But when asked who yells at you, it's mainly the female employer. Now, this is interesting, right? Name calling. I did a study also of domestic workers in Cairo, by the way, who are mainly refugees, mainly African refugees doing domestic work there, and Egyptian women. So name calling is an important form of abuse and belittlement, right? I'm not going to repeat all of these names, they're not very nice, but you can read them there. But again, you see 74% of the name calling is by the female employer, the madame of the household. Have your employers physically hit you? 14% said yes. Both female, the female employer is the largest proportion of physical abuse. Sexual harassment. You see here 7% said they were sexually harassed in one form or another. But typical with sexual harassment and rape, it's usually very much underreported because of the shame attached to it. So we always ask, not just of themselves, but say, do you know others who have been sexually abused? So then the figure goes up to 23%. It's not very, precise, but it gives you an idea, right? And who sexually harassed you, so you get the males primarily. I was giving a talk with some other researchers of domestic workers in Dubai many years ago in Media City. And the audience was primarily reporters, right? Not exclusively, but a huge room full of reporters and so on. And we were talking about these sorts of figures, and this agent stood up and said, look, you know, yeah, so it's 10% get abused, but, you know, the vast majority are well cared for and taken care of. And I got up and I said, well, what do you mean? What's this 10% that you're just brushing off like this? How many domestic workers in Dubai? There's about 500,000. So your 10% is about 50,000 women are being abused today. And that made a difference. When you took the percentage and actually got a figure, then everybody was shocked. In fact, the headlines in the newspaper the next morning was 50,000 workers being abused, right? So even though it's a small percentage, it's actually quite a significant number of people. These are the kinds of sexual harassment that were reported. Are you allowed to leave the house? So, 30%, almost a third, no. It's quite significant. Do they have their own room? most did, but some slept in the kitchen, on the balcony, with the children, and the conditions of the place of living for the domestic worker in the household is often quite problematic. Even in very luxurious apartments that I've seen and seen the plans for, you see very distinct. We've done a study of how everything is of less quality for the maid compared with the rest of the household. Even the tap fittings and things like this of her bathroom and so on, they're complete differences. So, who holds your passport? In Lebanon, it was a very high proportion. Basically, everybody's passport was held. Okay, so this is I'll give you some visuals now. This is in Bangladesh. These are women who are training to be domestic workers in the Gulf. This is in the Philippines. These are Filipina workers being trained on how to set a table. This is a poster in Bangladesh by Western Union, which is the company that makes billions of dollars from sending the remittances of workers' wages back to their home countries. This was at Beirut Airport. When the domestic workers arrive by plane, they're taken by General Security in a line to the General Security office, from where the employer or an agent comes to collect them, right? So they're singled out as a particular category of people entering the country. As I was taking the photograph, the General Security officer came up to me and told me to stop taking photographs. I didn't listen. I took another one. And so from a distance, you can see the employer. Oh, you can't see that. Oh, can you see it? No, it didn't come out very well. Over here, here's a domestic worker. Here's the employer who's come to collect her, taking her luggage. And he is given her passport by General Security, gives him her passport, and he holds on to it. Sorry, that didn't come out very well. Okay, here was some photographs I took in a place called Dawra, where a lot of domestic workers go on their day off. And here are two domestic workers of this guy. He arrived with a baby, two domestic workers. They're going shopping on their day off. So he's got the baby, and they head off to go shopping, and the baby goes crazy. He starts crying because they have left him, right? So the dependency on domestic workers, particularly for children, is huge. They become the main carers of the children, even though they may not be trained as nannies. They're often employed to do that kind of work. And in the absence of childcare centres and so on, this is a cheap way of providing childcare. In Jordan, the UN UNIFEM, as it was called then, now it's called UN Women, commissioned a Jordanian artist to do some drawings and caricatures of the domestic worker relationship in Jordan and in Lebanon and so on. And these are the cartoons. This is one of the cartoons that he drew, in relation to that previous thing that, here's the long lost son. Who does he come to? The Sri Lankan domestic worker as his mother, right? And his mother's rather shocked when he bypasses her. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but this next slide became quite famous in Lebanon, where this woman. This is during the demonstrations against the Syrians after the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. These are the demonstrations. And this Lebanese woman brings along her Sri Lankan domestic worker to demonstrate, right, holding a Lebanese flag, and the caption is, "Madame wants Syria out," right? So she's doing the bidding of her employer. Amazing photo. And then there was this one where the wife says to the husband, she's all battered and bruised, "I will only tolerate your beating and insults in one case only. Get me an Asian maid to take it all out on her, then beat me as much as you want." Now, this is interesting because this is an assumption that the abuse against the domestic worker by the madame of the house is a function of her being abused by her husband, right? So this is and it's been argued in some of the literature that it's a patriarchal issue, that the abuse is a patriarchal abuse, even though it might be perpetrated by women. I'm not sure about this. In the study that I did, we asked domestic workers about this, and there was no correlation between the levels of abuse and abuse within the family. There was no correlation at all. But nonetheless, it's an assumption that many people do make. Again, the same sorts of issues about violence against domestic workers. It's the norm, and it's nothing to worry about. And here, I work and clean, but I'm not a machine. You know, the Philippines government is the most entrepreneurial of all the countries of origin, and has many, many regulations to protect Philippine domestic workers as well as other Philippine workers. And they seek to both maximise the number of jobs that they get abroad, but also to protect them. It doesn't always work. They quite often have bans against countries where there's a lot of abuse of Filipinos. But it doesn't always work. Other countries have done that. Indonesia has banned all Arab countries. You know, so we have this phenomenon. Once the bans are put in place, then it actually becomes a moral hazard. People still want to go and find work and find better jobs than they would find at home, and so they go illegally, which makes them more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse and trafficking and so on. Deaths, there were many deaths that we looked into. I just published a paper on the deaths back in the early 2000s in Lebanon. Sorry, that shouldn't be there, but that was a woman who committed suicide. There are many suicides. Lastly, Human Rights Watch did an awareness-raising campaign with regard to migrant domestic workers in Lebanon in 2008. And they did these posters. So they got Lebanese women to dress up as maids, to put a maid's uniform on, and then they had these captions like, "Have you ever been punished for breaking a plate? Have you ever been called a donkey at work? Hamara," which is the very common term that is used. "Have you ever worked for years without a day off? Have you ever been denied food when you are hungry?" You know, refrigerators there have locks on them.
This is one, I think, not reality.
My refrigerator where I live here has a lock on it. It's very common that they lock the refrigerator so that the domestic worker cannot take food from the fridge at will. I'm sorry, that's a reality. Maybe not with everybody. The point is this: do you think that that campaign was a success or a failure by doing these things? What do you think? You think it worked? You don't think it worked? Why?
Because probably they just ignored it. I don't know. I can't believe that they wouldn't know what they're doing to their mates. Like I don't think they need a campaign to be aware of the fact that they're like harassing or like insulting them or treating them poorly. I don't think it could
Well,
be, but I don't.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I think it would have been a failure as well, because in your statistics you showed that children themselves were starting to call the maids names or were insulting and abusing the maids. So it is actually a generational issue. So whether that abusive behaviour is internalised and merely showing captions of what abuse looks like or what you may feel as an abused person, I don't think it's sufficient to incur behaviour change or behaviour modification in people.
Yeah. Anybody else? Well, it was a failure, but not for the reason that you, well, maybe partly for the reason you gave. It was a failure because the Lebanese women were insulted that anybody should put a maid's uniform on them, right? There's a clear racist issue here, that they were upset that they could be considered and required to empathise in this way with the domestic worker. Bear in mind that what happens in many of these jobs, particularly domestic workers, is that these positions, these jobs themselves, the occupations, become racialised. In other words, in previous times when maybe Lebanese women were doing domestic work, which they were, young girls at various points from the age of 8 onwards, from a poor family would be placed into a richer family, and they would grow up and be educated and so on within that family, but work as domestic workers, what we now call domestic workers, right? Or as servants, if you like. But once these foreigners took these positions, they could no longer do it. Why? When I was there, the position of a domestic worker was called a Sri Lankiyi, right? And the joke was that this little boy was overheard in the classroom to ask his friend, "Is your Sri Lankiyi a Filipina?" Which shows you how powerful that racialization of the position is. So that to do this to a Lebanese woman, and if a Lebanese woman took up such a position, she'd be teased. "Oh, you're a Sri Lankiyi," right? So she wouldn't put herself in that position. Now, the extent to which that might happen here, probably very similar. So many occupations get racialised in this way through migrant labour of one form or another. That's it. Any comments or questions?
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
It's okay, maybe
That's okay.
reality is the stakes, are you say, but I want to say something.
Yes.
How, for the housemaid or the servant, up to you, for the expression, how will close the refrigerator? I think this is one liar. Why? Because she's responsibility about the house. She's already one of the family. She stay all the day with the family. Specialized in Gulf area, I speak about her, yani. She's do everything in the house. I think you can't close for the food. This one issue is not from Islamic, it's from all the religion. Nobody can make someone stay with him in the house, with kids, with life. I think she's one of the family.
Sorry, let me just interrupt you for a moment. It's one thing to say that they shouldn't. It's another thing to say that they don't, right? So when you say they cannot, okay. I'm sorry, but they can. And we know that they do. Your personal experience is not the general understanding. So you need to do the studies, you need to see the research, that shows that this occurs. I'm not, you should not take this personally. I mean, I'm not accusing you or anybody else, but I'm saying that this is common and it happens. It shouldn't happen, but it does. And we need to understand why this sort of thing happens. We want to understand why a Muslim would do that. And we know that they do. So this is the point. Don't take it personally, because I'm not accusing you.
No,
right?
I understand.
Or any of
you
your
speak-
family
yeah,
or
yeah,
your
of course.
friends.
No,
right?
no, I speak by logic. يعني nobody, if she work with you as a housemaid or work with anyone, you must be care with her because she's
Look,
with you. It's
look,
one life. يعني that's what I mean. It's by
absolutely.
logic. يعني.
Look, what we don't understand is this. Why would a person, an employer, or a family abuse a woman who is going to take care of your children or who is going to cook for you? Why would you abuse them
Yes.
when they're going to do that for you? You're asking for trouble.
Yeah.
And there have been troubles.
Yes,
you
yes.
know, some domestic workers from time to time can't take it anymore, and they respond, you know. One of the first things I did when I went to Cairo was to visit a young Indian woman who had killed her madame,
Yes.
and she was
my
in
God.
prison. And I went to meet her and find out what that was all about. It was amazing. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on that. It's very negative. Any other comments? You want?
Just asking if there has been any conversation about like the economic solutions that could make it more valuable to the employers to keep their employees properly. So as you mentioned at the beginning, that for example, like the policy system was convenient. So is there any work where you can actually make it make treating the research about making the employee a good thing to show that it's actually like better economically for the employer towards the end of the working.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. Basically, there is a general understanding that the better you treat workers, the better they're going to be and the better relationship you're going to have and the more productive they will be. We have tried to do studies, implement studies on this. But under the kafala system, which basically did not facilitate competition between employers for employees, in other words, there's no local labour market, competitive labour market, what we're going to see in Qatar, and what I'm very excited to research and monitor, is where the kafala system has been abolished and where workers can change employers without permission of their sponsor, the kafil. In fact, the legislation in Qatar has completely changed. There's no longer any reference to kafala, kafil, or makful. It's all changed, right? So we're going to see a local labour market develop, we think. That's what the abolition of the NOC stands for No Objection Certificate, which is the permission of the employer. So if that's abolished, it means that I, as an employer, can go to somebody here without having to go back to their country of origin, go to employees here and say, look, I'll give you more money, I'll give you better conditions if you come and work for me, right? And that's competition. And we'll see what happens when and if this gets implemented. And it's a really interesting research field in Qatar right now for exactly that. Thank you. Yes.
Just comment on that. We have a similar example in Jordan, and it's basically because of the supply and demand of jobs. So for private schools, what they do is they employ people at the very, very beginning of the year, and they say, for example, the salary is 300, and they force teachers to quit at the end of the school year, which is in May, and then they rehire them again in August to save salaries for the summer. And at the time of payment, they do pay them the 300 because that's what the government monitors, but they have to pay back the school illegally 100, so that's effectively at 200. So the government puts so many bans and so many rules and regulations, whatever,
not work. So anything that's being done is being done on the surface, but then everything goes back what it was below the surface.
Yeah, yeah. That's right, and that's well put. What's above the surface and what's below the surface, and you really have to do the research to know what's going underneath. Unfortunately, you see a lot of things that are not very pleasant. But for me, I find it important to reveal. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Is it possible for the workers to have contact with each other? Do they have phones? Do they
Oh, yeah.
unions?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. No unions. While unions are not explicitly banned, the conditions for forming a union are so prohibitive that it basically amounts to the same thing. But today, look, the government in Qatar, for example, has almost provides for these things and provides computers to the accommodation sites and internet and so on. And most workers have mobile phones. It's the way they can contact their families at home, which has been recognised as extremely important. And also to send money back home. You can do that on your, at an ATM or on your phone if you have those applications. Yeah. So you're now filling out your evaluation forms or something, are you? Yes.
I just want to say something to Mira, right? It is more a question of upbringing. When, say, for example, in India, there are a lot of Bangladeshi employees, though they are being under the contract of so-and-so companies. I could say the actual reality that locking refrigerators do happen. And apart from that, as it's Hindu culture over there, which is like Muslims are being also influenced by that thing. If you are familiar about the Varna system, the class discrimination that Hinduism is all about, and which Muslims are also adopting in a way, you will be shocked if you know that some premises within the household, the servants are not allowed to enter those areas, and if they do, what happens next? There is a typical word in Sanskrit, Shuddhikaran. The floors are being washed with the water, and that to a religious water, a kind of religious water as per their understanding. And I am not saying that it is only done by the Hindus. It has also been adopted by the Muslims who are living there. So in the, let's say, not so educated societies of Muslims, they do know, after knowing the religious ethics and all, they do follow the same patterns. So there is addition to such kind of discrimination. Being a Muslim too, those things happen. So there is a broader, broader examples that we shouldn't neglect. There are different discriminations done by Muslims, though we tag, oh no, we are Muslims. Scriptures are totally different what actually Muslims nowadays are. So.
Thank you. I believe time has run out. We're half an hour late for lunch and prayers. So thank you very much for your attendance and for your participation, and enjoy the rest of the winter school. Thank you.